And what was it that first put the Pongamia tree on your radar? How did you first kind of come
Yeah.
across this concept?
Yeah, so my brief background, I always talk about Terviva being a food and agriculture company, but I'm decidedly more an agriculture guy than a food guy. I heard about Pongamia for the first time in late 2008. And at that time, I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. I was doing my MBA. I was interested in, renewables and energy markets, and biofuels was a really hot topic at that time. A lot of folks were looking at what they called second generation biofuels, things that wouldn't be corn or soy, that wouldn't compete directly with the food supply, that we could use to make biofuels. And Pongamia was one of those crops that always came up. Some venture capital folks that I knew out here in the Bay Area were looking at it, had heard of it. And then a group of folks had gotten together and decided that they might want to try to start some kind of enterprise around Pongamia. And, being the scrappy, poor grad student that I was looking for some consulting work. And so I picked up, basically a project to go look at Pongamia in India. I'm Indian by background, born and raised here in the States, and Pongamia is very commonly planted in India. And so in early 2009, I jumped on a plane, flew into the central Indian city of Hyderabad, got into a car, drove for 4 or 5 hours, and spent the next 2 or 3 days looking at Pongamia in its native environment. What I saw then is what is the basis for Terviva now. You see these legume trees, these Pongamia trees, growing surprisingly well in poor quality agriculture land. And some of these trees, not all of these trees, but some of these trees were producing abundant quantities of these beans. This was actually around March, April of that particular year, 2009, which is the time that the Pongamia crop matures on the trees. And I was just kind of blown away by it. It looked like a really simple and elegant solution to scaling up the supply of a lipid feedstock, as we call it, for biofuel. So I was finishing up grad school. I was young and newly married, and I convinced my wife to let me continue to play around with the tree for about 3 months. 3 months became another 3 months, became another 3 months. And about a year into it, again, like any kind of young, scrappy, sort of student of the game, I had won a investment pitch plan competition. And it was for about $100,000. This is about a year later, May of 2010. And that was a go, no-go point on whether or not to form a company, because the investment had to go to a company, not an individual. So quite literally, the company was formed in May of 2010, about a year into the journey, stimulated by this initial, $100,000 investment.
And did you say those trees in India that you're looking at, were those like planted, cultivated, somebody was growing those, or is that just they're native to that area? Or both?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. The Pongamia tree is planted all over the subtropics. It was even introduced into the United States in Florida over 100 years ago. It's considered a Polynesian canoe crop, for example. There's a specimen of a Pongamia tree in downtown Honolulu in the botanical garden, and that tree is probably 70 or 80 years old. Really, Pongamia is probably native to Southeast Asia, if you kind of went way back in history. Its modern largest manifestation is in India, because in the last 4 or 5 decades, it's been used very actively as a reforestation species. Because it's a legume, because it's real tough. It tolerates, in particular, Pongamia tolerates erratic moisture. So it can tolerate a lot of water and not enough. And so it's been favored as a reforestation crop. And I think something pretty unique to India that not a lot of people know about, I think everybody knows India has a lot of people. They have a lot of people still in rural India, 700 million people. And India also has a relatively large tribal community. They have about 150, almost 200 million people that are literally tribal, and they live in tribal areas in rural India. And this tree is commonly planted in those areas because that land is often pretty degraded in those areas. So bottom line, in India, uniquely, Pongamia and several other types of trees are planted in rural areas for reforestation, and communities actually gather the crop and sell it typically for some limited purposes.
What are those limited purposes? What is the current market over there for these trees?
Yeah, interestingly, in India, there's a ancient sort of medicinal text some people have heard of
Huh.
called the Ayurveda.
Huh.
Pongamia is actually in the Ayurveda. So the beans of Pongamia, the oil, the protein, they are not food grade. They're very bitter, very, very bitter. It turns out that the bitter compounds in Pongamia have mild medicinal properties. And so going way back into ancient times, that's what the beans were used for. The oil itself is mildly antifungal and antimicrobial. So you see some applications like that in India. More modernly, you see the oil being used for a whole variety of non-edible applications like soap making, leather tanning, wood curing. Might sound strange that these things kind of happen at some scale, but again, there's 1.4 billion people, so there's a lot of wood to be cured, so to speak,
Yeah.
soap to be made. And then the actual meal component also being bitter because it's rich in protein, it has nitrogen. And so it's used as a fertilizer. It's
Right.
used as a very basic soil amendment. And that market, Tim, is pretty small, even in India, maybe 25 to 50,000 tons. There's far more trees planted in India than just the amount of supply that's being used.
Hmm.
And that's because the principal purpose over the last 4 or 5 decades was for reforestation.
Yeah.
Outside of India, you do see it planted in Indonesia. It's in Thailand, Vietnam. It was brought to Queensland, Australia pre Western contact, but you see the most of it in India.
Okay. Yeah, and you saw this, back in 2009 as an intern, and it sparked this business plan that won a competition. Was the business plan at that time saying, hey, I see this crop that can grow in these crazy conditions. It's really good for reforestation, good for the environment in a lot of ways, but it's bitter, and the uses are somewhat limited. So I'm going to start a company around kind of commercializing the product. Is that what it was? Or was it a food company? Or kind of what was the business pitch at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I was too naive to understand how complicated it would actually be to take something that was semi-domesticated, fully domesticate it, and also advance the products into the market at larger scale. So, but I guess, if it looks easy, it's hard, and if it looks hard, it's impossible, right? So the idea was to do it all. And I'll probably embarrass to say, I even thought if we did it for Pongamia, we could do it for other crops because Pongamia is not the only crop like this, right? There's a lot of these frontline community crops, right? Indigenous community crops. Some we know of more than others, like shea nut, cashew, acai, right? These things are all out there that are essentially these wild harvest, wild crops. So I said, we're going to start with Pongamia and we're going to fully domesticate it and get stable yields. And we're going to figure out how to use the beans for more things besides cosmetics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously that turned out to be very difficult, taking a long time, taking a lot of money, but it was that vision. It was that vision to, basically bring the world a new scalable crop.
And so then you said that was the decision point. The $100,000 had to go to a company, so you formed a company. And was it called Terviva at that point?
It was called Terviva. We actually at the time called it Terviva Bioenergy because we figured nobody would know what the heck Terviva was.
Yeah.
And one of the paths we picked at that time was for sure we were going to use some part of the crop for bioenergy. And bioenergy was a tagline because the truth is in 2009, 2010, there was no ag tech.
Yeah.
Right? There was literally no category. There used to be a ag innovation conference that was run by the Danforth Center. You've probably been to that before. And it was I think we went to the second one ever.
Oh, cool.
In 2011 or something. That was when you could fit the whole entire ag tech industry into an auditorium. And so, yeah, we called ourselves Bioenergy at that time. We dropped the bioenergy, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago as our product set started to really expand beyond just, bioenergy.
Sure. Well, and I'm sure at that point, kind of the reality sort of set in here that, okay, this is a massive undertaking. Where did you start and kind of what were the wins that were early enough to keep you going?
Yeah, the cliche is true that it's better to be lucky than smart when you build businesses like this. I think so many things have to work in your favor even to have the modest amount of success that we've had. We had two things we had to work on to kind of go back to the original concept. We had to work on the genetics because we knew the yields weren't predictable enough. And we had to work on the markets for the beans. In particular, if we knew we could use the oil for biofuel because the oil was bitter, that protein that was left over was still too bitter for animal feed. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to work on that. I would say there were a couple of really fortuitous circumstances along the way. There's many, but there's a couple that were definitional to our progress. The first was that we found a target geography in the US to work on this tree. When we first started taking specimens of Pongamia, candidate elite genetics of Pongamia that we had sourced from a group in Australia where they had done some good work investigating high promising varieties of Pongamia, we planted them all over. We planted them in Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Pongamia is pretty cold sensitive. And so anywhere that you get sustained freezing temperatures or it snows, you're going to have problems. It turns out that, really the best place to grow Pongamia in the US would be Florida and Hawaii. Yeah. The set of fortunate circumstances that came around those two geographies was that in Florida, as we started to get to work there in 2011 and 2012, they were facing the collapse of the citrus industry. You might have heard of that. There used to be about 1 million acres. When we showed up, they were about 7 or 8 years off from there being 1 million acres of citrus in the ground in Florida. And there was a disease, an incurable disease that was wiping out the trees. And as we sit here today, there's less than 300,000 acres of citrus in Florida. You had this huge tree farming community looking for a large scale new tree crop. So what are the odds?
Yeah.
And that happens to just be in our backyard.
Yep.
Right? You have all the infrastructure, you have all the talent. And so we got some early cultivars of Pongamia in the ground there. About 4 or 5 years in, they did reasonably well enough that we were able to go from planting 5 acres, 10 acres, about 100 acres that was scattered across the state. We were able to take that next step up to the next commercial scale point.